He's not my boyfriend, I said, right as Lucas Hale pulled me into his arms and proved me wrong in front of 50 people. The flash of cameras hit first, sharp and blinding, like lightning in a room that had no business being that bright. And for a second I forgot how to breathe, forgot my own name, forgot every single rule we had agreed on exactly 72 hours ago. This was supposed to be simple. One weekend. That was the deal. 48 hours, technically, because I had shown up late on Friday night with a wrinkled button-down and zero intention of getting involved in whatever chaos Lucas had dragged me into. Just pretend, he had said. Voice low and calm like this was nothing. Like asking someone to fake being your boyfriend was the same as asking for a cup of coffee. No feelings. No complications. I remember laughing. Actually laughing, because it sounded ridiculous and safe at the same time. Safe, because Lucas Hale didn't do feelings. Everyone knew that. He was the kind of man who wore control like a second skin, always composed, always one step ahead. The kind of guy who could walk into a room and make everyone else feel like background noise. And me? I was just there. Just Ethan Cole, the guy who said yes too fast and thought too much afterward. The weekend started like a performance. It had to. His friends were watching, his business partners were watching, even his ex, especially his ex, was watching, and suddenly I was standing closer to Lucas than I'd ever been. Close enough to notice the faint scent of his cologne, something clean and warm, close enough to feel the heat of his hand when it settled at the small of my back like it belonged there. Relax, he murmured once, barely moving his lips, his breath brushing the edge of my ear in a way that made my thoughts scatter. You're doing fine. Fine. Right. Because pretending to be someone's boyfriend apparently included laughing at the right moments, leaning in just enough, letting his fingers linger a second longer than necessary when he passed me a drink. It was all timing, all choreography, and I told myself I could handle it. I told myself it was just a role. But somewhere between the first fake smile and the second night, things started to slip. It was small at first. A glance that lasted too long. A touch that didn't feel rehearsed. The way his voice changed when he said my name when no one else was around. Quieter, softer, like it meant something. I noticed it. Of course I noticed it. I just chose to ignore it, because that's what you do when the line between fake and real starts to blur in a way you're not ready to deal with. And then Sunday came. The end. Or it was supposed to be. I had my exit planned, my excuse ready, my bag already packed in the corner of the guest room like a reminder that none of this was permanent. I remember standing by the door, fingers wrapped around the handle, telling myself to just leave before it got complicated. Before I did something stupid like wish it could last longer. Lucas didn't stop me. That was the part that hurt more than I expected. He just stood there, watching, expression unreadable as always, like none of it had mattered. Like I hadn't mattered. So I left. I walked out, told myself it was over, told myself that was the point. And for a few hours, I believed it. Until tonight. Until I saw him again across a crowded room, dressed like nothing had changed, like he hadn't completely rearranged something inside me in just one weekend. I should have stayed away. I knew that. I knew better. But Lucas had this way of pulling people back in without even trying. And before I could stop myself, I was standing in front of him again, heart doing something unsteady in my chest. Ethan, he said, like my name was something familiar, something he'd been waiting to say again. And then, before I could ask why he was acting like this, before I could remind him, and myself, that this was supposed to be over, he turned to the crowd, slipped his arm around my waist like it was the most natural thing in the world, and said the one thing that shattered every rule we had ever set. This is my boyfriend. For a moment, no one said anything, and that was somehow worse than the cameras, worse than the attention, worse than the way Lucas's hand rested at my waist like it had every right to be there, steady and firm and completely unbothered by the fact that he had just rewritten reality without asking me. My brain tried to catch up, tripping over the same thought again and again. This is not part of the deal. This is not part of the deal. I forced a smile because that was what I had learned over the weekend. Because pretending meant you never let the cracks show in public, even when your pulse was racing like you had just sprinted a mile. Someone laughed nearby. Someone else asked how long we had been together, and Lucas answered without hesitation, his voice smooth and effortless like he had been telling this story for years instead of seconds. Long enough, he said, glancing down at me in a way that made my stomach flip for reasons I refused to examine. Long enough for what? Long enough to make this believable. Long enough to make me forget that I had walked away from him just hours ago, thinking it was over. His thumb brushed lightly against my side. A small, almost absent movement, but it sent a sharp awareness through me that made it hard to focus on anything else. Too close. Way too close. I leaned in just enough to keep up the act, lowering my voice so only he could hear me. "What are you doing?" I asked, keeping my tone light, almost teasing, because that was safer than letting the confusion slip through. Lucas did not look at me right away. He kept his gaze on the person in front of us, nodding at something they said, playing the part perfectly. Of course he was. He always did. Then, finally, he tilted his head just slightly, his lips brushing near my ear as he spoke. Fixing a problem. Fixing a problem. That was all this was to him. A solution. A strategy. Something calculated. My chest tightened in a way I did not appreciate, in a way I definitely did not understand. Because if this was just another performance, why did it feel different? Why did he sound different? I pulled back just enough to look at him. Really look this time. And there it was again, that subtle shift I had noticed over the weekend. Something softer under the surface, something that did not match the calm, controlled version of Lucas Hale everyone else saw. It made me uneasy. It made me curious. It made me want to step back and step closer at the same time. "You could have warned me," I said, still smiling for the crowd, still playing along because apparently I was incapable of doing anything else when it came to him. His gaze flicked to mine, sharp and steady, and for a second the noise around us faded, like everything else had been turned down. "You would have said no." He was not wrong. I would have. I should have. That was the problem. I swallowed, forcing out a quiet laugh like this was all still part of the script. "You are unbelievable." "That is not new," he replied, and there was the faintest hint of something in his expression, not quite a smile, not quite anything I could name, but enough to make my thoughts stumble again. Someone called his name from across the room, and just like that, the moment shifted, the world rushing back in, loud and bright, and impossible to ignore. Lucas straightened slightly, his hand still at my waist, still grounding, still there. Always there. "Stay with me," he said under his breath, the words so quiet I almost missed them. Not an order. Not quite a request. Something in between. My instinct was to pull away, to remind him that this was supposed to be over, that we had rules, that I had already walked out once and could do it again. But my body did not move. My feet stayed planted. My hand, traitor that it was, curled slightly into the fabric of his sleeve like it had done it 100 times before. This is still fake, I told myself. It has to be. But the way his fingers tightened just a fraction, the way he glanced down at me again like he was checking if I was still there, made that thought feel less certain by the second. And that was the real problem. Not the crowd. Not the cameras. Not even the lie he had just told. The problem was that for the first time since this whole thing started, I was not sure which part of this was pretend anymore. The rest of the night blurred into a performance I could not step out of, every smile feeling a little too real, every touch lasting a fraction too long. And the worst part was how easily I kept falling into it, like my body had already memorized him in just one weekend and refused to forget. Lucas moved through the crowd like he always did, composed, confident, completely in control, but this time I was part of that orbit, pulled along at his side, introduced again and again with that same steady phrase that made my chest tighten every single time. My boyfriend. The words echoed louder than the music, louder than the conversations around us, louder than my own thoughts trying to make sense of it. I should have corrected him. I should have laughed it off, said it was a misunderstanding, something temporary, something harmless. Instead, I nodded. I smiled. I played along. Again. Because stopping now would have meant admitting that I did not understand what was happening, and I hated not understanding things, especially when it came to him. At some point, someone handed me a drink I did not ask for, and Lucas's hand shifted slightly, guiding me away from the center of the room, not rushing, not obvious, just enough to create space between us and everyone else. The noise faded a little as we stepped toward a quieter corner, the kind of place where conversations dropped into something softer, something more private. I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. "You are really committing to this," I said, keeping my voice light even though my thoughts were anything but. He glanced down at me, his expression unreadable in that familiar way that used to feel distant and now just felt complicated. I did not do things halfway. That tracked. Of course it did. Lucas Hale did not fake anything poorly. Even when he was pretending, he was convincing. Especially when he was pretending. I took a small sip of the drink just to have something to do, something to anchor myself, but my attention kept drifting back to him, to the way his presence filled the space without effort, to the way his eyes kept flicking back to me like he was checking something, like he was making sure I had not disappeared again. Again, the thought hit harder than I expected. I set the glass down on a nearby table, fingers curling slightly as I tried to push that feeling away. "You let me walk out," I said before I could stop myself, the words slipping out quieter than I intended, almost lost under the hum of the room. There it was. The thing I was not supposed to bring up. The thing that made this more than just a performance. Lucas stilled for half a second. It was subtle. Anyone else would have missed it. I did not. His gaze sharpened just a fraction, not cold, not distant, just focused in a way that made my pulse pick up again. "You wanted to leave." Simple. Direct. Like that explained everything. Maybe it did. Maybe I was the one complicating it. I let out a short breath that almost turned into a laugh. "That does not mean you had to make it easy." His jaw shifted slightly, like he was considering something, weighing it, and for once he did not answer right away. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, just heavy, like there was something underneath it that neither of us was saying out loud. Then he stepped closer. Not dramatically. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Just enough that the space between us disappeared again, that familiar warmth settling back into place like it belonged there. "If I had stopped you," he said quietly, his voice lower now, more private, "you would have thought it was still part of the deal." My breath caught, just for a second, because he was right. Again, I would have told myself it was another act, another move, another way to keep the illusion going. I swallowed, trying to steady the sudden shift in my chest. "And this is not?" I asked, softer now, the question slipping out before I could dress it up, before I could make it safer. For the first time that night, Lucas did not look like he had an immediate answer. His gaze held mine, steady and searching, like he was deciding how much to say, how much to show, and that alone was enough to throw me off balance more than anything else he had done. Because Lucas Hale always had answers, always had control, and right now, standing this close, with his hand still resting at my waist and the noise of the room fading into the background, it felt like something in that control was shifting. Just slightly. Just enough to matter. Lucas did not answer right away, and that alone felt louder than anything he could have said, the silence stretching between us like something fragile and dangerous at the same time, like one wrong word could snap it and send everything crashing back into something simpler, something easier, something fake. I held his gaze, even though part of me wanted to look away, wanted to retreat back into the safety of not knowing, because knowing meant I would have to deal with whatever this was becoming, and I was not sure I was ready for that. "Lucas," I started, softer this time, not performing anymore, not pretending, just saying his name like it actually meant something, because somehow it did now, and that was a problem I did not have a solution for. His hand shifted slightly at my waist, not pulling me closer, not letting me go, just there, steady and grounding in a way that made it harder to think straight. "We said no feelings," I added, the words sounding weaker out loud than they had in my head, like they had already lost their authority somewhere along the way. His jaw tightened just a fraction, and for a second I thought he might deflect, might turn this into something easier, something safer, but he did not. "You said that," he replied quietly, his voice low enough that it stayed between us, hidden from the rest of the room, from the noise and the lights, and the people who still thought this was just another polished version of him. That stopped me. Completely. Because it was true. I had said it. I had insisted on it, like rules could protect me from something I did not even fully understand at the time. I let out a breath, shaking my head slightly as I tried to hold on to something solid. "That does not change the deal. The deal ended when you walked out," he said, just as calm, just as steady, but there was something under it now, something sharper, something that made my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the crowd or the situation or anything logical. I blinked, thrown off balance again, because that was not how this was supposed to go. "Then what is this?" I asked, and this time I did not bother softening it, did not bother hiding the confusion, the frustration, the way my thoughts kept tripping over each other trying to catch up. He looked at me like he was deciding something again, like he had been doing all night, like every step he took was calculated except for the parts that were not, except for the parts that felt just a little too real to ignore. Then his fingers tightened slightly at my side, just enough to be noticeable, just enough to anchor me there when everything else felt like it was shifting. This, he said slowly, is me not pretending anymore. The words hit harder than they should have, harder than I expected, because I had been bracing for something else, something easier to dismiss, something I could categorize and move on from. But this was not that. Not even close. I opened my mouth, then closed it again, because for once I did not have an immediate response, did not have a quick comeback or a way to turn this into something less complicated. My thoughts scrambled, searching for something that made sense, something that fit into the version of reality I had been holding on to since Friday night, but nothing quite lined up anymore. You cannot just decide that, I said finally, even though it sounded less certain than I wanted it to, even though part of me already knew he could, that he already had. You do not get to change the rules halfway through. His expression shifted then, just slightly, something softer breaking through the usual control, something that made my pulse spike again for reasons I refused to examine too closely. I am not changing the rules, he said, his voice quieter now, more personal, like the rest of the room had faded out completely. I am telling you I never followed them. And that was worse. So much worse. Because it meant that while I had been carefully staying within the lines, convincing myself this was temporary, manageable, safe, he had been somewhere else entirely, somewhere I had not even considered, somewhere that made this whole situation feel a lot less like a performance and a lot more like something real. Too real. I swallowed, my grip tightening slightly on his sleeve without thinking, the movement small but impossible to ignore. Since when? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it, before I could protect myself from the answer. Lucas held my gaze, steady and unwavering, like he had been waiting for me to ask that, like he had already decided what he was going to say. Since before you said yes, he replied, and just like that, everything shifted again, the ground under my feet no longer as stable as it had been even a few minutes ago, and the only thing keeping me from stepping back was the way his hand was still there, still holding me in place like letting go was not even an option. For a second, I thought I misheard him, like my brain had twisted his words into something bigger than they were supposed to be, something heavier, something that did not fit neatly into the version of reality I had been clinging to since this whole thing started. But the way he looked at me did not leave room for misunderstanding, steady and certain, like he had already accepted the consequences of saying it out loud. Since before you said yes. The words echoed, louder than anything else, louder than the music, louder than the conversations around us, louder than the part of me that wanted to laugh it off and call it a joke. I let out a short breath, shaking my head slightly as I tried to regain some sense of control, some footing that made sense. That does not make any sense, I said, even though it clearly did, even though something in my chest had already shifted in response, something that felt dangerously close to hope, and that was exactly what I needed to avoid. Lucas did not react to the dismissal. He did not argue. He did not push. He just stayed there, his hand still at my side, his presence steady in a way that made it hard to ignore him, impossible to walk away without acknowledging what he had just said. It does not have to make sense to you right now, he replied, calm as ever, but softer now, like he was choosing his words more carefully than usual. That made it worse. Way worse. Because Lucas Hale did not soften things unless they mattered. I looked away for a second, just to breathe, just to create some distance that did not exist physically, my thoughts racing faster than I could keep up with. This was not part of the plan. None of this was supposed to feel like this. It was supposed to be simple, temporary, controlled. I forced out a quiet laugh, more reflex than humor. So what? You just decided that one weekend was enough to turn this into something real? I asked, glancing back at him, expecting him to correct me, to say yes, to make it easier to dismiss, easier to categorize as impulsive or reckless or anything that would make it less him. But he did not. No, he said, and the word landed firm, certain. I decided that before the weekend started. That stopped me again. Completely. Because that meant everything I thought I understood about this situation had been wrong from the beginning. The deal. The rules. The distance I thought we had. None of it had been the same for him. I swallowed, my fingers tightening slightly against his sleeve again without thinking, grounding myself in something physical because everything else felt like it was slipping. Then why make it a deal at all? I asked, quieter now, not defensive anymore, just trying to understand. His gaze softened just a fraction, enough to notice, enough to matter. Because it was the only way you would stay, he said simply. No hesitation, no deflection, just the truth, laid out in a way that left no room to hide from it. My chest tightened, sharper this time, because that sounded too real, too intentional, too much like something I did not know how to handle. I looked at him, really looked at him again, searching for any sign that this was still part of some larger strategy, some calculated move I had not caught yet. But there was nothing like that in his expression now, just a quiet certainty that made it hard to breathe normally. You are telling me, I started, my voice lower, more careful now, that this whole thing was never fake for you. It was not even a question. Not really. He held my gaze, steady as ever, and nodded once. That was it. No dramatic confession. No big speech. Just that. And somehow, that made it hit even harder. I exhaled slowly, my thoughts catching up in uneven waves, because if that was true, then everything changed. The way he had looked at me, the way he had touched me, the way he had let me leave without stopping me. None of it meant what I thought it did. None of it was as simple as I had convinced myself it was. I shook my head again, not in denial this time, just trying to process it, trying to find the right question, the right response, something that would put this back into a shape I could understand. Then why say nothing? I asked finally, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Why let me believe it was just pretend? Lucas's expression shifted again, just slightly, something more vulnerable flickering through before it settled back into that familiar control. Because if I told you, he said quietly, you would have walked away before it even started. And that was probably true. I did not like that it was true, but it was. I let out a breath, slower this time, my grip on his sleeve loosening just enough to remind myself I still had a choice here, that I could still step back, still put distance between us, still turn this into something manageable. But I did not move. I did not step away. Instead, I stayed right where I was, caught somewhere between the version of this that was supposed to be fake and the version that suddenly was not. And for the first time since all of this began, I realized the real problem was not that Lucas had changed the rules. It was that I was no longer sure I wanted them to stay the same. The realization settled in slowly, not all at once, but in pieces that kept rearranging themselves the more I tried to ignore them, like my mind refused to let it go back to something simple, something safe. And that was the problem, because safe meant distance, and distance meant walking away, and I was still standing here, still close enough to feel the steady warmth of his hand at my side, still close enough that leaving no longer felt as easy as it should have. I exhaled quietly, my gaze dropping for just a second before lifting again, because avoiding this would not make it disappear, and Lucas did not look like someone who was going to let this fade into the background anyway. You are making this complicated, I said, even though I was not sure if I meant him or myself, even though I was starting to realize the complication had been there from the beginning and I had just chosen not to see it. His expression did not change much, but there was a subtle shift in his eyes, something softer, something almost patient, like he had already expected this reaction and was waiting for me to catch up. It already was, he replied, calm as ever, and that should have frustrated me more than it did, but instead it just made my chest tighten again in that same unfamiliar way. I shook my head slightly, letting out a quiet breath that felt heavier than it should have. No, I said, more firmly this time, trying to hold on to something solid. It was simple. You needed a boyfriend for a weekend. I said yes. That was it. That was supposed to be it. That was the version of the story I understood, the one I could manage without overthinking every look, every word, every moment that now felt like it had meant more than I realized at the time. Lucas studied me for a second, really studied me, like he was deciding how much to push, how much to say. And for once there was no immediate response, no smooth explanation, just a quiet pause that made everything feel a little more real. Then his hand shifted, not pulling me closer, not holding me tighter, just adjusting slightly like he was reminding me he was still there, like leaving was still an option but not one he wanted me to take. And now, he asked, his voice lower, quieter, the question slipping between us in a way that made it impossible to ignore. I blinked, caught off guard again, because that was the part one did not have an answer for. The part one had been actively avoiding since he pulled me into this and changed everything with a single sentence. And now, I let out a short breath, glancing away for a second as I tried to find something that made sense, something that did not feel like I was about to step into something I could not easily step back out of. Now this is a mess, I said honestly, the words coming out softer than I intended, but no less true. Because you decided it was real without telling me. His gaze sharpened just slightly, not defensive, not distant, just focused, like he was taking that in, like he was actually considering it instead of brushing it aside. I did not decide it was real, he said, steady and certain, and I felt that shift again, that subtle change in the air between us that made it harder to breathe normally. It was real. I just did not tell you. That hit differently, not because it changed anything, but because it removed any room for me to pretend this was something new, something sudden, something I could dismiss as impulsive. This had been there. The whole time. I swallowed, my thoughts catching up in uneven pieces, because if that was true, then I had been the only one pretending, the only one following rules that he never intended to keep, the only one who thought there was a clear line between fake and real. That is not fair, I said quietly, not accusing, not angry, just stating it because it felt like the only thing I could hold on to right now. Lucas did not flinch. He did not look away. No, he agreed, just as quiet, just as honest. It is not. The simplicity of that response threw me off more than anything else he had said, because I expected him to justify it, to explain it, to turn it into something logical, but he did not. He just acknowledged it and stayed where he was, still close, still steady, still there. I looked at him, really looked this time, searching for something familiar, something I could categorize and understand, but what I found instead was something I had not noticed before, something softer beneath the control, something that made this feel less like a strategy and more like a risk. And that was the problem. Because if this was a risk for him, then it was definitely a risk for me, and I was not sure I was ready for that. I let out a slow breath, my grip loosening completely now, my hand falling back to my side even as I stayed where I was, even as I did not step away. You should have told me, I said finally, the words quieter now, less about blame and more about everything that had changed because he had not. Lucas's gaze did not waver. Would you have stayed? He asked, just as quiet. And there it was again, that question I did not want to answer, the one that sat right in the space between us and made everything feel heavier than it should have. I hesitated, just for a second, but that was enough. Because the answer was already there, even if I did not say it out loud, even if I was not ready to admit it yet. And I think he saw it, because something in his expression shifted again, not triumph, not relief, just a quiet understanding that made my chest tighten in a way I could not ignore anymore. And that was the moment I realized this was not about whether I should walk away. It was about whether I still could. The answer I did not give hung between us anyway, unspoken but obvious, and the worst part was how clearly he seemed to understand it, like he had already anticipated every reaction I could have before I even caught up to my own thoughts, and that should have irritated me. It probably would have a week ago, but now it just made everything feel heavier, more real, harder to ignore. I looked away first this time, not because I was done, but because I needed a second to breathe without his eyes on me, without that steady, unwavering focus that made it feel like he could see straight through every excuse I was trying to build. The room around us came back into focus slowly, the hum of conversation, the soft clink of glasses, the distant laughter that felt oddly disconnected from where we were standing, like we were caught in a separate moment that had nothing to do with anyone else. I let out a quiet breath and ran a hand through my hair, trying to reset, trying to pull myself back into something normal, something manageable. You do realize, I said after a second, my voice lighter now, almost teasing, even though the tension underneath it had not gone anywhere, that you just made this a lot harder for both of us. Lucas did not move. He did not step back. He did not loosen his hold. If anything, his attention sharpened slightly, like he was listening more carefully now, like every word mattered. Harder how? He asked, calm and direct, like this was still something we could define, something we could map out logically. I let out a short laugh, shaking my head again. Because now I cannot pretend this is just a favor. Anymore, I said, glancing back at him. meeting his gaze again even though it still made my chest feel tight in a way I did not quite understand. And you cannot pretend this is just strategy. His expression did not change much, but there was that shift again, that subtle softening that made it clear he was not dismissing this, not brushing it off. I was not pretending, he said simply. That is kind of the problem. I shot back, a little quicker this time, a little more honest than I intended. Because if he had been pretending, I could have handled it. I could have kept my distance, kept my expectations low, walked away without feeling like I was leaving something behind that might have mattered. But this was different. I exhaled slowly, my shoulders dropping just slightly as the tension settled into something quieter, something less sharp, but no less real. You should have told me. I repeated, softer now, not because I expected a different answer, but because it still felt like the turning point, the moment where everything could have gone another way. Lucas watched me for a second, his gaze steady, thoughtful, and for once there was no immediate response, no quick explanation, just a quiet pause that felt deliberate. Then he stepped a fraction closer, not enough to draw attention, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough that the space between us disappeared again, enough that I could feel the warmth of him, the steadiness, the quiet certainty that had been there all along. If I had told you, he said, his voice lower now, more personal, you would have overthought it. I blinked, caught off guard again, because that was accurate, annoyingly accurate. I let out a small breath that almost turned into a laugh. I am overthinking it now, I pointed out, even though there was less bite to it than before, less resistance. Yes, he agreed easily, and there was the faintest hint of something in his tone, not quite amusement, not quite anything I could name, but enough to make my thoughts stumble again. But you are still here. That landed harder than it should have. Because he was right. Again, I was still here. Still standing too close, still not stepping away, still choosing, even if I was not ready to admit it out loud. I swallowed, my gaze dropping briefly to the space between us before lifting again, because avoiding it was not going to change anything. That does not mean I know what to do with this, I said, quieter now, more honest, because there was no point pretending otherwise at this point. His expression softened just a fraction, something more open slipping through the usual control, something that made my chest tighten in a different way this time. You do not have to decide right now, he said, steady and certain, and for the first time since this conversation started, there was no pressure in his tone, no expectation, just space. Space to think, space to feel, space to figure out what this was becoming without being forced into an answer before I was ready. I let out a slow breath, the tension in my shoulders easing just slightly, not gone, but less overwhelming, less immediate. That might be the first reasonable thing you have said tonight, I admitted, glancing at him, and there was a faint hint of something in my voice now, something lighter, something that almost felt like relief. Almost. Lucas's lips curved just slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough to count. I am capable of being reasonable, he said, and the quiet confidence in his tone made something in my chest shift again, not sharp this time, not overwhelming, just there. Steady, present, real. And that was the part one could not ignore anymore. Because no matter how complicated this had become, no matter how many questions I still did not have answers to, one thing was clear in a way it had not been before. This was not going away. And neither, apparently, was I. The space between us did not widen after that, even though it should have. Even though everything in my head was still trying to sort through what this meant, what he meant, what I was supposed to do with the fact that walking away no longer felt like the obvious choice, and staying did not feel simple either. It just felt inevitable. I exhaled slowly, my gaze drifting past him for a second, watching the movement of people across the room, the way everything continued like nothing had shifted, like the ground under my feet had not just tilted in a way I could not ignore. So what now? I asked. Quietly, not sarcastic this time, not deflecting, just asking because I genuinely did not know what came next when something stopped being pretend and started becoming something else entirely. Lucas did not answer immediately, which was starting to feel like a pattern tonight. Each pause more deliberate than the last, like he was giving me space to think, or maybe giving himself time to choose the right words. His hand remained where it was, steady at my side, not possessive, not forceful, just there in a way that grounded me more than I wanted to admit. Now, he said finally, his voice calm. "We stop acting like this has an expiration date." That should have felt overwhelming. It should have made me step back, put distance between us, remind him that this had started as something temporary for a reason. Instead, I just stood there, processing it in pieces, because part of me had already been thinking the same thing and refusing to acknowledge it. I let out a small breath, glancing at him again, really looking this time, trying to read something in his expression that would make this easier to categorize, easier to understand. But there was no hesitation there, no uncertainty, just quiet certainty that made my thoughts stumble again. "You are very sure about this," I said, not quite a question, more like an observation I was still trying to catch up to. His gaze held mine, steady and unwavering. "I am," he replied simply, and there was no room in his tone for doubt, no hint that he was second-guessing any of this, and somehow that made it harder to hold on to my own hesitation. I shifted slightly, not away, just enough to remind myself I still had control over my own movements, even if I was not using it the way I probably should have. "You realize I am not," I said, quieter now, more honest, because pretending confidence right now felt pointless. His expression softened just a fraction, something more understanding slipping through. "I know," he said, and there was no frustration in it, no impatience, just acknowledgement, like he had already accounted for that, like my uncertainty did not change his stance at all. That should have annoyed me. It probably would have if I was not so focused on the way it felt to hear it, the way it removed pressure instead of adding to it, the way it made this feel less like a decision I had to make immediately and more like something I could step into gradually. I swallowed, my gaze dropping briefly before lifting again, because avoiding it was not going to help. Not anymore. "And you are just okay with that?" I asked, the words coming out softer than I intended. Lucas's thumb moved slightly against my side, a small, almost absent motion that still managed to pull my attention back to him completely. "I am not in a rush," he said, his voice low, steady. "But I am not letting you walk away thinking this meant nothing either." That hit differently. Not sharp, not overwhelming, just clear. Clear enough that I could not pretend I did not understand what he was saying. I let out a slow breath, my shoulders relaxing just a fraction as something in my chest settled into a quieter, steadier rhythm, not resolved, not certain, but no longer chaotic in the same way. "You really do not make this easy," I murmured, glancing at him again, and there was a faint hint of something in my tone now, something lighter, something that almost felt like acceptance. Almost. Lucas's lips curved slightly again, that barely their expression that seemed reserved just for these moments. "I am not trying to make it easy," he said, just as quietly. "I am trying to make it real." And that was the problem, because real meant risk. Real meant uncertainty. Real meant I could not hide behind rules and timelines and temporary agreements anymore. But real also meant something else, something I had been trying not to name since the moment he pulled me back into his world tonight. Something that felt a lot like possibility. I hesitated for a second, just long enough to notice it, just long enough to realize I was not stepping away from it this time. Then, before I could overthink it again, before I could talk myself out of it, I let my hand settle lightly against his sleeve, not gripping, not holding on, just there, a small, quiet choice that felt bigger than it should have. Lucas did not react immediately, but I felt the subtle shift in his posture, the way his attention sharpened just slightly, like he noticed every small change in distance, every movement, every unspoken decision. Of course he did. He always did. And for once, that did not make me want to pull back. For once, it made me stay. The moment my hand settled against his sleeve, everything seemed to sharpen at the edges, like the world narrowed down to just that point of contact, just that small decision that should have meant nothing, and yet somehow felt like the most deliberate thing I had done all night. Lucas noticed. Of course he did. He always noticed. His gaze dropped briefly to where my fingers rested, then lifted back to my face, steady and unreadable in a way that was starting to feel less like distance and more like restraint, like he was holding something back instead of having nothing to show. That realization alone made my chest tighten again. I should have pulled away. I knew that. That would have been the logical move, the safe move, the version of this that matched everything I had been telling myself since the beginning. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was, my hand still there, my body still angled toward him like leaving was no longer the instinct it used to be. "You are thinking too much again," Lucas said quietly, not accusing, not teasing, just stating it like a fact he had already accepted. I let out a small breath that almost turned into a laugh. "That is kind of my thing," I replied, glancing up at him. And there was something lighter in my tone now, something that had not been there earlier, something that felt dangerously close to comfort. He studied me for a second, like he was measuring that shift, like he was taking in every small change I was not even fully aware of yet. "Then think about this," he said, his voice low, steady. "If this was just pretend, you would have left already." That landed immediately. No delay, no confusion, just a clear, direct hit that left no room for deflection. I swallowed, my gaze dropping for a second before lifting again, because he was right, and I was running out of ways to argue with that without lying to myself. "Maybe I just do not like making a scene," I said, even though the excuse sounded weak the moment it left my mouth, even though we both knew it was not the real reason. Lucas did not call me out on it. He did not need to. The look he gave me said enough, calm and knowing, like he had already seen through every layer I was trying to hide behind. "You walked out before," he reminded me, not harsh, not pressing, just reminding. And that was worse, because he was not wrong. I had left when it was easier, when it was still simple, when I could tell myself it did not matter. But now I was still here, still standing close, still choosing not to leave even though I could. I let out a slow breath, my fingers shifting slightly against his sleeve, not pulling away, just adjusting like I was settling into something I had not fully acknowledged yet. "This is different," I admitted quietly, the words slipping out before I could stop them, before I could dress them up into something less revealing. Lucas's expression changed just a fraction, something softer flickering through before it steadied again. "I know," he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no doubt, just quiet certainty that made it harder to deny what was happening between us. I glanced at him, really looked this time, and for the first time since all of this started, I was not just trying to figure him out, I was trying to understand what I felt about it, what this meant for me, what I was willing to risk if I did not step back now. "You make it sound easy," I said after a second, my voice softer now, less defensive, more thoughtful. His gaze held mine, steady as always. "It is not easy," he replied, and there was something different in his tone this time, something more honest, more grounded, like he was not trying to convince me, just telling me the truth. "I am just not pretending it is something else." That hit in a way I did not expect, not sharp, not overwhelming, just clear. Clear enough that I could not hide behind confusion anymore, could not pretend this was still just a situation I had been pulled into without choice. I had a choice. I still did. The question was whether I was going to use it the way I had before. I hesitated for a second, my thoughts slowing just enough to notice the shift, to recognize that the panic I expected to feel was not there, replaced instead by something quieter, something steadier, something that felt a lot like calm. "Okay," I said finally, the word simple, almost too small for everything it carried, but it was the only one that felt honest. Lucas did not react immediately, but I saw it, that subtle change in his expression, the way his shoulders eased just slightly, the way his attention sharpened in a different way now, less guarded, more present. "Okay," he repeated, quieter now, like he was making sure he heard me right. I nodded once, my hand still resting against his sleeve, my feet still planted exactly where they had been for the past several minutes, except now it did not feel like I was stuck there. Now it felt like I was choosing to stay. "Okay," I said again, a little steadier this time, and for the first time since he pulled me into this tonight, the word did not feel like surrender. It felt like a beginning. For a second, nothing changed, and yet everything did. The single word still hanging between us like it had more weight than it should, like it had quietly shifted something fundamental without making a scene about it. And the strangest part was how natural it felt once it settled, how the tension that had been pulling tight in my chest all night eased just enough to let me breathe, without overthinking every second. Lucas did not rush to fill the silence. He did not push for more. He just stayed there, steady and close, like he understood that this moment did not need to be forced into something bigger, not yet. And that helped more than I expected. I let out a slow breath, my hand still resting against his sleeve, my fingers relaxed now instead of tense, like my body had finally caught up to the decision my mind was still trying to process. You are very calm about this, I said after a moment, glancing up at him. Because if the roles were reversed, I would have been a mess, talking too fast, thinking too much, trying to define everything all at once just to make sense of it. Lucas's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough to count. I am choosing not to rush you, he replied, and there was something deliberate in the way he said it, something intentional that made it clear this was not hesitation, it was control, but a different kind than I had seen before, less about managing a situation and more about protecting it. That thought caught me off guard. I shifted slightly, not away, just enough to look at him more directly, studying him in a way I had not allowed myself to before, and the more I looked, the more I noticed the details I had missed, the subtle changes in his expression, the way his attention stayed fixed on me like I was the only thing that mattered in this moment. And that realization alone made my chest tighten again, but not in a way that made me want to step back. You keep doing that, I said quietly, the words slipping out before I could filter them. Acting like this is already something. His gaze did not waver. It is something, he said simply, and there was no hesitation in it, no doubt. Just quiet certainty that made it harder to hold on to my own uncertainty without questioning it. I let out a small breath, my thoughts slowing just enough to take that in without immediately pushing back. You are very sure of yourself? I murmured, and there was a hint of something in my tone now, not quite teasing, not quite challenging, just curious. His expression softened just slightly, something more open slipping through the usual composure. I am sure about you, he corrected. And that landed differently, softer but somehow deeper, like it bypassed the part of me that wanted to argue and went straight to the part that did not know how to respond at all. I looked at him, really looked this time, and for a second everything else faded again, the room, the noise, the people, all of it slipping into the background as my focus narrowed to just him, just this moment, just the quiet certainty in his voice that did not feel forced or exaggerated, just real, too real. I swallowed, my grip shifting slightly against his sleeve again, not pulling away, not holding tighter, just there, a steady point of contact that grounded me in a way I was starting to rely on. You do not even hesitate, I said, softer now, more to myself than to him, because that was the part one could not fully understand. How he could stand here so certain while I was still sorting through every possible outcome in my head. Lucas tilted his head slightly, studying me with that same steady focus. I did hesitate, he said quietly. Before. I blinked, caught off guard again, because that was not what I expected. Before. I repeated, my voice barely above a murmur. He nodded once, his gaze never leaving mine. Before I asked you. He clarified, and something in his tone shifted, something more honest, more unguarded than anything he had shown so far. After that, I stopped. That made my chest tighten in a different way, not sharp, not overwhelming, just full, like something had settled into place without asking permission. I let out a slow breath, my thoughts quieting just enough to take that in without immediately trying to analyze it. That is a very you way of handling things, I said softly, and there was a faint hint of something in my tone now, something that almost sounded like acceptance. Lucas's lips curved again, slightly more this time. And you are still here, he replied, and there was no pressure in it, no expectation, just a simple observation that felt heavier than it should have. I glanced down briefly, then back up, because avoiding it did not make it less true. Yeah, I admitted, just as quietly, and for once the word did not come with hesitation, did not feel like something I needed to justify or explain. It just was. And that was the part that surprised me the most, because staying no longer felt like a mistake. It felt like a choice I was finally ready to make. The word stayed between us longer than it should have, not awkward, not heavy, just present in a way that made everything else feel quieter, like the world had softened around the edges without asking permission, and for the first time that night, I was not trying to escape that feeling, not trying to explain it away or reduce it into something temporary. I was just standing in it. Lucas did not move, did not shift away, did not break the moment with something unnecessary, and that restraint, that quiet patience, made it easier to stay where I was, easier to let this unfold without immediately building walls around it. I let out a slow breath, my shoulders relaxing just slightly as I looked at him again. Really looked, and it was strange how different he seemed now, not because he had changed, but because I had stopped forcing him into a version that made sense to me. "You are very confident," I said softly, not as a challenge this time, not as a defense, just as something I was noticing more clearly now. His gaze held mine, steady as always, but there was something warmer in it now, something less guarded. "Not about everything," he replied, and that caught me off guard again, because it was the first time he had admitted to anything that sounded like uncertainty. I tilted my head slightly, studying him with a kind of curiosity I had not allowed myself before. "But about this," I added quietly, because that part was obvious. He nodded once, simple, certain. "Yes." No hesitation. No overthinking. Just that. I let out a small breath that almost felt like a laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was unfamiliar. The idea of being on the receiving end of that kind of certainty, without having to earn it or question it. "That is a little terrifying," I admitted, my voice quieter now, more honest than I intended, because it felt like the kind of thing I would usually keep to myself. Lucas did not dismiss it. He did not brush it off. He just looked at me, his expression softening just enough to matter. "It is not supposed to be," he said, calm and steady, like he was not trying to convince me, just offering something real. I shook my head slightly, a faint smile pulling at the corner of my mouth despite myself. "Easy for you to say," I murmured, glancing away for a second before looking back, because even now, even with everything that had shifted, I was still adjusting to this version of him, this version of us. The noise of the room filtered back in around us, the soft hum of conversations, the distant clink of glasses, the reminder that we were not alone, that this moment was happening in the middle of something public, something that had started all of this in the first place. I shifted slightly, my hand still resting against his sleeve, but now it felt more intentional, less accidental, like I was aware of it in a way I had not been before. "People are still watching," I said under my breath, a quiet reminder of the situation we were technically still in, even if it no longer felt like the main focus. Lucas's gaze flicked briefly toward the room, then back to me, unfazed. "Let them," he said simply, and there was something in his tone, something firm but not forceful, that made it clear he was not concerned about appearances right now, not in the way he usually would be. That was new. I noticed it immediately. "You care less than I expected," I said, a little surprised, because everything I knew about him suggested the opposite. His expression shifted just slightly, something more thoughtful passing through. "I care," he said, quieter now, more deliberate. "Just not about the same things anymore." That made something in my chest tighten again, not sharply, just noticeably, like another piece of this was settling into place whether I was ready for it or not. I studied him for a second, trying to understand what that meant, trying to see how far that shift went, and the more I looked, the more I realized this was not temporary, not a reaction to the situation, but something that had been building long before I stepped into it. "You really meant it," I said softly, the realization finally catching up fully, not as a question, not as doubt, just as something I was finally accepting. His gaze held mine, unwavering. "I do not say things I do not mean," he replied, and there was no room for interpretation in that, no space to twist it into something easier. I swallowed, my grip shifting slightly again, my fingers brushing more deliberately against his sleeve now, a small movement that felt bigger than it should have, like a quiet confirmation I had not planned to give. "Okay," I said again, softer this time, but steadier, because now it carried more weight, more understanding, more intention. Lucas did not respond with words this time, but I saw it, that subtle change in his posture, the way his shoulders eased, the way his attention stayed locked on me like nothing else in the room mattered. And for once, I did not feel like pulling away from that. For once, I let myself stay exactly where I was, not because I was unsure, not because I was stuck, but because I was choosing it, fully aware now of what that choice meant, and not running from it anymore. For a moment, neither of us moved, and it felt like the world had quietly adjusted around that stillness, like everything else had dimmed just enough to make space for something more important, something that did not need to be rushed or defined too quickly to be real. I let out a slow breath, the tension that had been sitting in my chest all night finally, settling into something steadier, something I could actually hold on to without feeling like it might slip away if I looked at it too closely. Lucas's hand was still at my side, unchanged, consistent, And somehow that consistency mattered more now than anything dramatic could have, because it felt intentional, not performative, not temporary, just there. "We should probably move," I said quietly after a second, glancing toward the room where people were still watching, still pretending not to watch, still curious in that way people always are when they think they are witnessing something interesting. My voice sounded calmer than I expected, more grounded, like I had already made a decision I was still catching up to. Lucas followed my gaze briefly, then looked back at me, his expression steady. "Do you want to leave?" he asked, not assuming, not deciding for me. And that small difference did not go unnoticed. I considered it for a second, really considered it, not as an escape this time, not as a way out, but as an option I could choose without pressure. The idea of leaving did not feel urgent anymore. It did not feel necessary. It just felt like one possibility among many. I shook my head slightly. "Not yet," I replied, and there was something quiet but certain in my voice now, something that made the words feel heavier than they should have. Lucas nodded once, like that answer was enough, like he was not going to push it further than I was ready to go. That mattered more than I expected. We stepped back into the flow of the room together, not dramatically, not drawing attention, just moving like we had done this before, like we knew how to exist in the same space, without questioning every step. And maybe we did. Maybe the weekend had not been as temporary as I told myself it was. Maybe it had already changed something I was only now willing to acknowledge. Conversations picked up again around us, people approaching, voices blending together in that familiar way that should have pulled me out of this moment, but it did not. Not completely. Because even as I responded, even as I smiled and nodded and played my part in a way that no longer felt entirely like a performance, I was still aware of him, still aware of the way he stayed close without crowding me, the way his presence anchored me without demanding anything in return. At one point, someone asked a question I barely registered, something about how long we had been together, and I hesitated for half a second, just enough to notice it, just enough to feel that old instinct to deflect, to correct, to pull back into something safer. But I did not. I felt Lucas's attention shift slightly toward me, not interrupting, not answering for me, just there, waiting. And that was new. He was giving me the choice. I took a small breath, my fingers brushing lightly against his sleeve again, a quiet grounding point, and then I answered. "Not as long as it feels," I said, the words coming out easier than I expected, softer, but honest in a way I had not been ready for before. There was a brief pause, a flicker of curiosity from the person in front of us, but then the conversation moved on, like it always did, like the world kept turning no matter how much had shifted beneath the surface. Lucas did not say anything right away, but I felt it, that subtle shift in his attention, the way he registered what I said without making a big deal out of it. And that felt right. We stayed like that for a while, moving through the evening without forcing anything, without rushing into something we had not fully defined yet, but also without pretending it was still something it was not. And somewhere in the middle of that, between the quiet glances and the small, unspoken choices, I realized something that should have been obvious much earlier. This was not about a weekend anymore. It had not been for a while. I just needed time to catch up to that truth. And now that I had, even just a little, walking away did not feel like an option I wanted to take anymore. Not tonight. Maybe not at all. By the time the night began to wind down, something had shifted in a way that no longer felt temporary, not fragile, not uncertain, just quietly settled, like a decision that had been made without needing to be announced out loud. The room had thinned out, conversations growing softer, people beginning to leave in small groups, and the energy that had once felt sharp and overwhelming now felt slower, almost calm, like everything had finally caught up to where we were standing. I exhaled quietly, glancing around for a moment before letting my gaze return to Lucas, because no matter how much the room changed, my focus kept coming back to him without effort, without hesitation. "You are still here," I said softly, the words coming out more like an observation than anything else, but there was something under it, something that meant more than the simple statement. He met my gaze, steady as always, but there was something warmer there now, something that had not been as clear before. "So are you," he replied, just as quietly, and the simplicity of it made my chest tighten in a way that felt familiar now, not overwhelming, just real. I let out a small breath that almost felt like a laugh, shaking my head slightly. That still surprises me, I admitted, because it did, because if someone had asked me a few days ago how this would end, I would have said I would leave, that I always left when things got complicated, when things stopped being easy to explain. But I had not. I was still here. Lucas studied me for a second, like he was taking that in, like he understood exactly what that meant without needing me to explain it further. "You are allowed to stay," he said, his voice low, steady, and there was no pressure in it, no expectation, just permission in a way I had not realized I needed until that moment. I blinked, caught off guard by how simple that sounded and how much it mattered anyway. "I know," I said after a second, quieter now, because I did know, but hearing it still changed something, still made it feel more real in a way I could not ignore. "Hey." Brief silence settled between us again, not uncomfortable, not uncertain, just full, like it did not need to be filled with unnecessary words. I shifted slightly, my hand brushing against his again, not by accident this time, not something I could dismiss as a habit or a reflex, just a small, deliberate movement that felt like a quiet confirmation of everything I had not said out loud yet. Lucas's fingers adjusted in response, not grabbing, not holding tightly, just aligning with mine in a way that felt natural, like it had always been meant to happen this way, even if I had taken longer to realize it. I looked down briefly at the contact, then back up at him, because avoiding it no longer made sense, not when I had already decided to stay. "This is new," I said softly, not as a complaint, not as hesitation, just acknowledging it for what it was, something unfamiliar but not unwelcome. His gaze held mine, calm and certain. "So we take it one step at a time," he replied, and there was something in his tone, something steady and grounded, that made it easier to accept that, easier to believe that this did not have to be rushed or defined all at once to be real. I nodded once, a small movement, but it felt like agreement in a way that went beyond words, like I was finally letting go of the need to control how this unfolded and just allowing it to exist as it was. The room around us had almost emptied now, the noise fading into something distant, something unimportant, and for a moment it felt like we were the only two people left in a space that had once been crowded with expectations and assumptions and rules that no longer applied. I let out a slow breath, my shoulders relaxing completely for the first time that night, and when I looked at him again, there was no hesitation left, no instinct to pull back or second-guess what this meant. "I am not leaving," I said quietly, the words simple but certain, not dramatic, not forced, just honest in a way I had not been at the beginning of all this. Lucas did not react immediately, but I saw it, that subtle shift in his expression, the way something eased, the way his attention stayed steady and focused. On me like that was all that mattered. "I know," he replied softly, and this time, the words did not feel like an assumption. They felt like understanding. I held his gaze for a second longer, letting that settle, letting everything that had happened tonight fall into place in a way that finally made sense, not because it was simple, but because I was no longer trying to make it something it was not. And as we stood there, in the quiet after everything had shifted, I realized something that felt both unexpected and completely inevitable at the same time. This had never really been about pretending. Not for him, and not anymore for me.